Jack Mallory watched the dark Atlantic waters swirl around his boots as the Sea Maiden groaned, listing heavily to port. His hands, calloused by 30 years of honest labor, trembled as he pried open the rusted safe in the corner of his father's garage. He expected to find old maps or family heirlooms. Instead, he pulled out a leather-bound ledger filled with his wife's elegant handwriting, detailing millions of dollars in payments from the city's most notorious crime lord. Every lucky catch and every repaired engine was a lie, a debt he never knew he was accruing. The heavy crunch of gravel snapped his head toward the window. A matte black SUV had pinned his truck against the garage door, its headlights cutting through the salt mist like the eyes of a predator. Two men in heavy coats stepped out, their silhouettes blocking the only exit as they adjusted the weight of the steel tucked into their waistbands. Jack looked from the incriminating books to the encroaching shadows, realizing that while he had been fighting the waves, someone else had been steering his life toward a storm he couldn't survive. The engine of the SUV didn't turn off. They weren't here to talk. They were here to collect. Jonathan Mallory gripped the greasy steering wheel until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. The vibration of the aging diesel engine shuddered through his boots, rattling his knees with a rhythmic, bone-deep ache. Sea Maiden, a vessel that had carried the Mallory name through 3 centuries of Atlantic salt, groaned under the weight of a heavy list to the port side. She wallowed in the troughs, her rusted gunnels scooping up mouthfuls of slate-gray seawater with every sluggish roll. A thick, suffocating mist of brine and diesel exhaust hung in the wheelhouse, stinging Jack's eyes and coating his tongue with the bitter taste of failure. Through the salt-crusted glass, he squinted at the hazy silhouette of Gloucester, Massachusetts. The port lights were mere smudges of sickly yellow, bleeding into the fog. Suddenly, the engine emitted a sharp, metallic clang, a sound like a dying gasp, and belched a column of oily black soot into the darkening sky. Jack shoved the throttle to dead slow. The boat drifted, fenders squealing against the rotting, barnacle-encrusted pilings of the pier, settling into her berth with a weary, defeated thud. The deck felt alien beneath Jack's feet, a treacherous, shifting thing after 14 days of losing a fistfight with the North Atlantic. Jack stood at the periphery of the auction floor, his hand twitching inside a pocket that held only a crumpled, empty pack of cigarettes. Before him sat 3 plastic crates, pathetic and lonely on the vast concrete floor. Inside, nestled on a bed of rapidly melting slush, lay 24 scrawny redfish and a meager handful of shrimp. The auctioneer didn't even pause. His gaze skated over the meager offering without a flicker of interest. His voice remained a dry, rhythmic drone, calling out prices that met only stony silence from the huddle of wholesalers. Not a single plastic paddle rose. Jack watched the buyers turn their backs, their boots echoing as they migrated toward the overflowing bins of the corporate trawlers. A cold trickle of sweat traced a path down Jack's spine. In his head, the math was a brutal execution. Fuel costs, ice, pier fees, all subtracted from a zero-sum gain. A knot tightened in his gut, hard and cold. He realized with a sickening jolt that Sea Maiden would be sleeping with dry tanks tonight. Jack shoved his shoulder against the swollen wood of the garage door, forcing it open with a groan that seemed to echo his own exhaustion. The air inside hit him like a physical weight, thick with the stench of mildew and ancient axle grease. From a leak in the roof, water struck the concrete floor with a rhythmic, maddening plink, splashing onto shelves cluttered with the detritus of a lifetime spent at sea. Jack kicked a dented, empty jerry can across the floor. He began tearing through soggy cardboard boxes, his movements frantic and jagged as he searched for a simple tin of roofing nails. His fingers brushed against rusted anchor chains, tangled nests of rotted netting, and cracked plastic floats. His breathing grew shallow, hitching in his chest. In a sudden burst of directionless fury, He hurled a heavy pipe wrench into the far corner. It struck a pile of oily rags with a muffled thud. Jack collapsed onto his knees amidst the junk, the adrenaline draining away to leave only a thin, oily residue of helplessness. Above him, the leak continued its steady, methodical assault, striking the back of his head like a ticking clock. Jack's fingers tore through a layer of dusty burlap, meeting the bite of cold, pitted steel. He yanked the heavy canvas shroud away, revealing a massive iron cube. The gray paint was flaking off in jagged scales, exposing the dark metal beneath. Near the top of the door, Jack traced the faint, engraved initials of his father, J.M., nearly swallowed by decades of grime. He rested his palm against the heavy tumblers of the combination dial, feeling a fine tremor vibrate through his arm. As he pressed his ear to the cold surface, the scent of parched paper and machine oil wafted through the hairline cracks of the seal. He tried to summon the numbers from the basement of his memory. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the delicate click, click, click of the internal discs as he gingerly dialed the first sequence, feeling every mechanical tooth through the sensitive pads of his fingertips. Jack wedged the tip of a crowbar into the narrow seam of the safe door. He threw his entire weight onto the tool, his breath escaping in a guttural grunt of exertion until the metal yielded with a sharp, echoing crack. The door swung wide on dry hinges, belching a cloud of stale, mothball-scented air into the garage. Jack reached into the dark maw and hauled out a stack of heavy, leather-bound ledgers. He fumbled the first one open. The sight of the handwriting made his blood turn to slush. The elegant, right-leaning script of his wife, Sarah. Long columns of figures marched down the pages, categorized by date with a terrifying, surgical precision. Every cent was accounted for. Jack's hands shook as he flipped the pages, watching Sarah document sums that dwarfed the meager income he had supposedly brought home. Jack's finger traced a line where "engine overhaul" sat next to a bold notation. Paid in full cash. He flipped another page. There were receipts for property taxes, settled last October, a month when Sea Maiden had been trapped at the dock with a shattered drive shaft. A dark fog clouded Jack's vision as he stared at the endless settle stamps on tuition bills and medical insurance premiums. He searched frantically for the source, but the sender column held only cryptic, two-digit codes. A hollow chill bloomed in his chest. He realized that his heroic struggles to keep the family afloat were nothing more than a charade, a pathetic theater performed against the backdrop of this hidden, torrential river of money. Near the back of the final ledger, a folded sheet of high-quality bond paper fluttered to the floor. Jack picked it up. At the top of the page, an embossed logo for a private investment firm shimmered under the dim garage light. Below it lay the bold, sweeping signature of Thomas Radcliffe, the name of the man who owned the Gloucester docks, and the shadows behind them seemed to sear Jack's retinas. He recoiled as if the paper were white-hot. He reread the dates of the transfers. They formed an unbroken chain stretching back 5 years. Every piece of new equipment, every high-end sonar rig, even the silk dress Sarah wore for their anniversary. It all bore the invisible brand of Radcliffe. Jack pressed a hand over his mouth, the sour taste of bile rising in his throat as the true scale of his servitude crystallized. Jack began a frantic, mental cross-reference. He compared the dates of his most prosperous fishing trips to the entries in Sarah's secret books. The days he supposedly hauled in record-breaking catches of cod and haddock aligned perfectly with massive deposits into Radcliffe's accounts. He remembered the odd port workers who always insisted on unloading his crates in the dead of night, no questions asked. The truth hit him like a physical blow. Under the silver scales of the fish, he had been moving Radcliffe's filth. Every scar on his palms, every salt-stung night at the helm was a cruel joke. Sea Maiden wasn't a fishing boat anymore. She was a laundry machine. He wasn't a captain. He was an oblivious mule in a high-stakes game of cleaning blood money. A sharp crunch of gravel beneath heavy tires snapped Jack out of his stupor. He lunged for the grimy window. A matte black SUV had slithered into the driveway, blocking the exit like a predatory beast. Two men climbed out, their leather jackets strained over shoulders that looked unnaturally broad in the twilight. Jack caught the distinct, heavy bulge of holsters beneath their coats as one man adjusted his belt. The SUV's headlights cut through the gloom of the garage, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, panicked spirits. Jack froze, pressing his back against the cold wall. The sound of the car doors slamming shut echoed in his ears like twin cannon blasts, severing any hope of a quiet exit. Radcliffe's henchmen crossed the yard with a slow, rhythmic thud of heavy boots on the concrete path. Jack watched as the lead man stepped into the doorway, his massive frame blotting out the evening light and casting a long, jagged shadow across the floor. The second man peeled off, circling the garage to cover the rear exit and the fire escape. The air in the small space seemed to vanish, replaced by the suffocating fumes of spilled gasoline. The man in the doorway slowly removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes as cold and vacant as a winter sea. Jack's grip tightened on the ledger, the sharp corners of the leather binding digging into his calloused palm as the circle closed. The lead enforcer stepped into the pool of light from the single overhead bulb, the yellow glow highlighting a jagged scar that ran from his ear to his chin. He rested a heavy, proprietary hand on the safe that had belonged to Jack's father. A thin, cruel smile touched his lips, revealing a row of crooked teeth. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble as he informed Jack that the season of charity had officially concluded. He began rattling off the total sum of the investments Radcliffe had made in the Mallory family, a number so astronomical it made Jack's lungs seize. The man leaned in close, the smell of expensive tobacco and peppermint cloying on his breath. He whispered that it was time for Jack to earn his keep by handling special assignments for Mr. Radcliffe out in the deep water. Jack looked down at his trembling hands, the realization sinking in that every move he had made for years had been choreographed by Thomas Radcliffe. In the enforcer's eyes, he saw the predatory triumph of a hunter who had finally cornered a long-tracked animal. His life, his reputation as an honest man of the sea, and Sarah's safety were all suspended by a thread that Radcliffe held between his thumb and forefinger. The weight of the ledgers felt like lead, dragging his spirit down to the grease-stained floor. He understood now that he didn't own the Sea Maiden. He didn't even own his own name. He was just a tool, bought and paid for long before he ever knew he was for sale. Jack burst into the kitchen, his shoulders slamming into the door frame with a violence that made the glassware in the drying rack rattle and chime. He heaved the heavy, leather-bound ledgers onto the floral-patterned tablecloth. They landed with a dull, final thud, sending a cloud of ancient paper dust swirling into the air. Jack jabbed a trembling finger at the books, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches, his face a mask of crimson fury. Sarah Mallory flinched, the dish towel slipping from her fingers to the floor. She stood frozen, her gaze locked on the undeniable evidence of her long-term deception. Jack demanded the truth, his voice rising to a guttural roar that drowned out the whistling of the tea kettle. With a sudden, jerky motion, he swept the ledgers off the table, sending them skittering across the floor to stop at Sarah's feet. Sarah didn't shrink away. Instead, she drew herself up, her spine going rigid as her eyes flared with a sudden, defensive fire. Her fingers gripped the edge of the laminate countertop until her knuckles turned the color of bone. She spat her words back at him, a torrent of pent-up resentment. She reminded him of every empty whiskey bottle she'd found tucked under the mattress, every night he'd come home smelling of the docks and despair while the children cried from hunger. Her voice rang with a bitterness that had been fermenting for years, cutting through Jack's blustering attempts at moral outrage. She pointed toward the empty refrigerator and the tattered, salt-stained boots their son had outgrown months ago. She accused him of being a coward who hid in a bottle while the world burned around them. Each word hit Jack with more force than a rogue wave, eroding the last of his pride. A thin, pained smile touched Sarah's lips as she finally confessed to the clandestine meetings with Thomas Radcliffe in the shadows of the North Wharf warehouses. She described the paralyzing, icy terror of the eviction notices that had driven her to accept the first envelope of cash. Jack watched as she wrapped her arms around herself, a reflexive gesture of protection against the memory of her bargain. She spoke with a cold, rhythmic clarity about how Radcliffe's money had paid the heating bills and kept the bank from seizing the Sea Maiden. Her eyes remained dry and hard, fixed on Jack's face as she explained the brutal cost of their survival. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was demanding he acknowledge the reality he had been too drunk to see. Jack sprinted down the damp, salt-slicked planks of the pier, his lungs burning as he gulped down the frigid night air. At the base of the Sea Maiden's gangplank, he skidded to a halt. Thomas Radcliffe stood there, his charcoal cashmere coat a stark, wealthy contrast to the rusted, peeling hull of the boat. 3 guards flanked him in a loose semicircle, their postures relaxed, but their hands resting significantly on the hems of their jackets. A single overhead floodlight caught the sharp, predatory lines of Radcliffe's face and the glint of gold at his wrists. Jack felt the pier vibrate beneath his boots as the heavy SUVs rumbled into position, sealing off the entrance to the dock. Radcliffe took a slow, deliberate draw from a cigar, exhaling a plume of blue smoke directly into Jack's face. Radcliffe reached into the interior pocket of his coat and produced a sleek, navy blue folder. He held it out with a flick of his wrist. Inside, the pages of heavy bond paper crinkled in the wind. Jack stared at the fine print, his eyes landing on the name of a shell corporation, an entity that now legally owned the Sea Maiden. The signatures on the bottom of the pages looked hauntingly like his own, though the memories of signing them were lost in a fog of bar-room lights and cheap gin. Radcliffe tapped a manicured finger against the corporate seal, informing Jack that he was no longer a proprietor. A cold sweat broke across Jack's brow. He was a deckhand on his own heritage. Radcliffe's smirk was thin and razor-sharp, savoring the moment the realization broke Jack's spirit. Radcliffe stepped closer, leaning into Jack's personal space until the scent of expensive cologne and tobacco was overwhelming. His voice dropped to a whisper that sounded like sandpaper on iron. He began a dry recitation of federal statutes: money laundering, racketeering, tax evasion, charges that would ensure Jack spent the rest of his life in a concrete box. He promised that the ledgers would find their way to the district attorney's desk by morning, unless Jack took the boat out tonight. The ultimatum was chillingly simple: the hold of a prison or the hold of a ship. Jack felt a phantom noose tighten around his throat as Radcliffe casually examined his fingernails. The sheer weight of the threat paralyzed Jack, stripping away any thought of resistance. Jack's gaze flickered past Radcliffe's shoulder. In the deep shadows of an abandoned fish packing plant, he spotted the dull gray silhouette of a van with blacked-out windows. Atop the van, a slender whip antenna rotated slowly, cutting through the swirling mist. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The state police were already there, watching the docks through high-powered lenses. His heart skipped a beat as he caught the faint, bluish glow of monitors reflecting in the van's side mirror. He was trapped in a pincer movement. The criminals were in front of him, and the law was closing in from behind. He clenched his fists, the feeling of being a hunted animal under a sniper's scope making his skin crawl. At a sharp nod from Radcliffe, two of the guards stepped forward and seized Sarah by the elbows. She let out a sharp, strangled cry of surprise as they hauled her backward. Jack lunged toward her, but the cold, hard muzzle of a pistol pressed firmly into his solar plexus, freezing him in place. Sarah was shoved unceremoniously into the back of a black SUV. The mechanical clack of the central locks sounded like a gavel hitting a bench. Radcliffe leaned in, informing Jack that Sarah would be returned home only after the cargo cleared the international buoys. Jack watched the red glow of the taillights as the car vanished into the fog. A toxic mixture of fury and impotence rose in his throat, thick and bitter as bile. Radcliffe clapped a hand on Jack's shoulder, leaving behind the ghost of his scent and a promise of violence. He ordered Jack to fire up the diesel and have the Sea Maiden's systems humming within 3 hours. With a tilt of his head, he indicated the heavy, unmarked crates that men in balaclavas were already winching through the aft hatch. Radcliffe reminded him that every minute of delay was a minute Sarah spent in a very dangerous situation. Jack looked at his watch, the sweep of the second hand, feeling like a countdown to his own execution. Radcliffe melted back into the fog, leaving Jack alone on the deck with the hum of the harbor and the weight of a dead man's debt. Jack descended the steep, narrow ladder into the engine room, where the air was a shimmering haze of heat and a sharp, chemically pungent odor. He unscrewed the cap of the auxiliary fuel tank and recoiled. The liquid inside was a fluorescent, unnatural hue, nothing like the amber tint of standard marine diesel. Moving into the dark recesses of the bilge, he found rows of hermetically sealed steel canisters, lashed to the hull with heavy-duty nylon webbing. A faint, low-frequency hum seemed to emanate from the metal, and a thin layer of frost coated the outside of the containers despite the engine's heat. Jack realized the cargo wasn't just illegal, it was volatile. The steel plates of the Sea Maiden no longer felt like a hull. They felt like the walls of a coffin. Jack stepped into the cramped wheelhouse and noticed a thin black wire snaking out from beneath the navigation console. He ripped away a plastic panel, revealing a small radio transponder. A tiny red LED blinked with a rhythmic, mocking pulse. The police hadn't just been watching. They had tagged the boat like a migratory shark. The beacon would lead the Coast Guard cutters straight to his position the moment he hit open water. He was caught between the law's tracking device and the life of his wife. His fingers hovered over the device, trembling with the indecision of whether to rip it out and face Radcliffe's wrath or leave it and face a lifetime in a cage. Jack's hands settled onto the worn, salt-pitted handles of the wheel. He could feel the pulse of the harbor through the ship's bones. He was a man with no good choices left, a captain of a ghost ship sailing into a storm that had been brewing for 5 long years. Jack turned the ignition key, and the Sea Maiden's steel frame buckled under a series of violent, mechanical spasms. Instead of the familiar, comforting thrum of the engine, a high-pitched, metallic shriek ripped through the air, sounding like a serrated blade being dragged across a saw. A spray of fine metal shavings erupted from the housing of the propeller shaft, and the deck plates beneath Jack's feet began to vibrate with a frequency that set his teeth on edge. The sharp, acrid scent of scorched iron and vaporized lubricant flooded the wheelhouse. The screeching intensified, becoming a deafening whistle that made Jack's ears pop. On the dashboard, the needle of the tachometer danced erratically before slamming into the red, signaling the catastrophic failure of the transmission. Sarah noticed the guard's attention wander as he fumbled with a lighter. She didn't hesitate. She threw her weight against the SUV door and lunged into the night. Her heels struck the frost-covered planks of the pier with a frantic, rhythmic tapping as she bolted toward the Sea Maiden. The biting wind tore at her face, pulling strands of hair loose from her bun. She scrambled over the heavy mooring lines, her foot slipping for a terrifying second over the black, churning water between the boat and the dock. Her voice was a raw, desperate rasp as she reached the deck, waving her arms to catch Jack's attention. She grabbed the cold metal railing of the gangway, pulling herself up just as the heavy boots of the guards began to thud behind her. Sarah's fingers dug into the rough canvas of Jack's coat, pulling him close until their foreheads touched. Her breath was hot and fast against his ear as she whispered what she'd heard while trapped in the car. She told him about the orders Radcliffe had given his men, to scuttle the ship once it cleared the harbor lights. Jack felt the tremors radiating through her body. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the dull, amber glow of the instrument panel. Every word she spoke about the death trap Radcliffe had planned felt like a hammer blow to Jack's chest. The sound of the failing engine and the slap of the tide against the hull seemed to fade, replaced by the terrifying clarity of their impending execution. Jack dropped into the bilge, where oily, dark water already swirled around his ankles. He clicked on a heavy flashlight, sweeping the beam across the port side hull. He froze. Fresh, jagged score marks from a grinding wheel marred the steel of a primary rib. One of the main riveted seams had been ground down to a paper-thin sliver of metal, barely holding against the pressure of the Atlantic. Jack reached out, his fingers brushing against a temporary wooden brace that groaned and flexed with every swell. It was a crude, effective timer. He knew that the moment they hit the open sea and the hull began to work in the waves, the brace would snap, and the Sea Maiden would become a sinking stone. The lead enforcer on the dock raised his arm, and the dull finish of a semi-automatic pistol caught a stray beam of light. He aimed the weapon directly at Sarah's chest, freezing her in her tracks as she tried to reach the cabin. The man stepped onto the deck, his boots crushing a discarded section of netting. His voice was a flat, dead sound as he ordered Sarah back to the pier. Jack watched the man's trigger finger tighten, a terrifyingly small movement that would end everything. The air between them felt thick, pressurized, and the usual cacophony of the harbor fell away into a vacuum of silence that amplified the sound of the wind whistling through the rigging. Jack pressed his forehead against the cold, salt-streaked glass of the porthole. Through the swirling mist, he saw two dark trucks skid to a halt at the entrance to the wharf. Men in tactical gear jumped out, hauling heavy, rusted anchor chains. They began wrapping the links around the iron gateposts, the sound of metal grinding on concrete echoing through the harbor as they padlocked the exit. Jack watched the perimeter close, turning the pier into a steel-rimmed cage. The glare of the truck's headlights hit the wheelhouse, blinding him and cementing the reality of their isolation. The Sea Maiden was a prisoner, caught between Radcliffe's chains and a sea that had been rigged to swallow her whole. Jack looked at Sarah, her face pale and drawn in the flickering light of the cabin. A sudden, brutal realization pierced through his fear. His obsession with the Sea Maiden had been nothing but a selfish delusion. He had used the tradition of the Mallory name as a shield to hide his own failures. And in doing so, he had allowed Sarah to carry a burden that was now crushing them both. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing the air from his lungs. He had been so blind, so focused on the ghost of his father's ship, that he hadn't seen the woman standing right in front of him. His pride had been the real anchor, and it had dragged them both into the depths. A sharp, hissing sound drew Jack's attention back to the cargo in the hold. From beneath the lid of one of the steel canisters, a thin ribbon of acrid white vapor began to curl into the air. The moment the gas touched the bilge water, it began to bubble and hiss with a violent intensity. Jack's throat burned with the scent of scorched rubber and bleach. The water seeping through the sabotage seam was reacting with Radcliffe's chemicals, generating a terrifying heat. He could see the metal of the container beginning to warp and bulge. The Sea Maiden wasn't just a sinking ship. She was a pressure cooker, and the fuse was already lit. Sarah suddenly stepped in front of Jack, her body a shield between him and the enforcer's gun. Her shoulders were square, her chin tilted up in a gesture of defiance that Jack hadn't seen in years. Her voice was steady, cutting through the wind, as she told the gunman that the cargo wouldn't move an inch until they were guaranteed safe passage. Jack saw a flicker of genuine hesitation in the man's eyes. He wasn't prepared for a woman with nothing left to lose. Sarah stood her ground, a solitary figure of iron will, turning herself from a hostage into the only thing standing between the criminals and their payday. Jack grabbed a heavy fire axe from its bulkhead mount, the wooden handle smooth and familiar in his grip. He swung with everything he had. The steel blade bit into the main electrical distribution panel with a bone-jarring crunch. Blue sparks erupted, showering Jack's face and singeing his hair. He struck again and again, hacking through copper bus bars and ceramic fuses until the ship's systems died with a long, mechanical moan. The wheelhouse plunged into a darkness, broken only by the orange flicker of short circuits. Jack leaned on the axe, his chest heaving. He had just killed the boat, and in doing so, he had ensured they weren't going anywhere. Heavy boots began to hammer against the metal gangway as the enforcers moved to board the ship. At that exact moment, a violent gust of wind screamed across the harbor, snapping the rotted crossarms of an old light pole on the pier. The massive floodlights shattered against the deck, raining glass down on the attackers. The entire wharf was plunged into a chaotic, shifting gloom. Jack heard the shouts of the men as they lost their footing in the dark. The shadows of the harbor seemed to come alive, a swirling mess of wind and rain that gave Jack and Sarah a single, fleeting heartbeat of an opportunity. Jack ripped the cap off a red plastic jerry can, and the stinging, volatile scent of gasoline flooded the wheelhouse. With a wide, desperate arc, he doused the navigation charts, the paper soaking up the fuel until it turned translucent. Heavy droplets splashed against the wooden paneling, pooling in the grooves of the floor. He scrambled out onto the deck, emptying the rest of the can over the mounds of nylon netting, which drank the gasoline like a thirsty animal. His hands were slick with the fuel as he tossed the empty container aside. The rainbow sheen of the gasoline spread across the rusted deck, shimmering with a lethal beauty in the reflected harbor lights. Sarah snatched a heavy flare gun from the orange emergency locker. The weight of the flare gun was solid and reassuring. She leveled the weapon at the lead enforcer's chest, her finger tightening on the trigger. The men froze, their eyes widening as they stared down the wide, black bore of the signal pistol. Their shadows danced erratically on the wet planks of the pier as they realized she was serious. Sarah stood her ground, her feet planted wide against the wind. The enforcers began a slow, scraping retreat, their boots scuffing the concrete until they hit the very edge of the wharf. Her gaze was a steady, burning thing that promised a fiery end to anyone who dared to move. Jack pulled a battered Zippo from his pocket and flicked the lid open with a sharp, metallic clink. He struck the flint, and a small, defiant flame bloomed in the wind. He let the lighter fall. The moment it hit the gasoline-soaked netting, a roar of orange fire erupted, climbing the mast in a hungry, twisting spiral. The heat hit Jack like a physical blow, searing his skin as the Sea Maiden transformed into a pyre. The flames devoured the nylon and the wood, sending a shower of sparks into the night. Radcliffe's men recoiled, shielding their eyes from the sudden, blinding glare that turned the ship's hull into a glowing ribcage of fire. A wall of flame surged between the boat and the pier, cutting off the enforcers with a barrier of pure heat. A column of thick, oily black smoke spiraled toward the sky, blotting out the stars over Gloucester. The roar of the fire drowned out the panicked shouts of the men on the dock. Within seconds, the first wail of a siren drifted across the water, followed by the rhythmic thumping of emergency lights. Jack watched the red and blue flashes reflecting in the harbor. The massive blaze had turned the secret operation into a beacon that could be seen for miles, stripping Radcliffe of his most powerful weapon, the dark. Jack reached inside his jacket and pulled out a heavy plastic bag containing the secret ledgers. He took a short, powerful run and hurled the package over the curtain of fire. It sailed through the heat and landed with a solid thud on a patch of clear concrete near the police line. He watched as a sergeant lunged forward, snatching the bag and clutching it to his chest. The evidence that had been a noose around the Mallory family's neck for 5 years was finally in the hands of the law. Jack wiped a smear of soot from his forehead, a grim sense of relief washing over him as he saw the officers beginning to fan out, their weapons drawn. The lead enforcer, his face twisted in a mask of desperation and rage, leaped through a gap in the flames onto the aft deck. Jack didn't hesitate. He swung the fire axe in a low, brutal arc. The flat of the blade caught the man's knee with a sickening, wet crack. The gunman let out a strangled shriek as his leg buckled, sending him crashing onto the white-hot metal of the deck plates. His pistol skittered across the floor and vanished into the inferno. Jack stood over him, the axe held ready, his breath coming in jagged gasps. The heat from the burning plastic was becoming a physical weight. But Jack didn't move until he was sure the man was no longer a threat. Sarah grabbed Jack's hand, her grip like a vice. She yanked him toward the port side, where the fire hadn't yet reached the emergency ladder. Jack stumbled over a pile of smoldering debris, but she held him upright, dragging him toward the rail. Beneath their feet, the ship began to emit a terrifying, high-pitched whistle as the chemicals in the hold reached a breaking point. They vaulted over the side, hitting the hard concrete of the pier with a bone-jarring impact. They scrambled away from the hull just as the air behind them began to shiver and hum with a mounting, unnatural pressure. A massive, concussive boom rocked the harbor as the canisters in the hold finally detonated. The Sea Maiden vanished in a sphere of white light and flying steel. The shockwave slammed Jack and Sarah onto the wet pavement, pinning them down as a rain of debris hissed into the water. The remaining enforcers were tossed like rag dolls, disappearing into the dark gaps between the pilings. Burning wood and twisted metal pelted the police cruisers, shattering glass and denting hoods. Jack shielded Sarah with his own body until the last of the shrapnel had fallen. The silence that followed the explosion feeling heavier than the noise. Jack and Sarah sat on the cold concrete, their clothes scorched and their faces masked in a thick layer of gray ash. Through the smoke, Jack watched the police converge on Thomas Radcliffe. They forced him against the side of a cruiser, his expensive coat dragging in the oily grime of the pier. The click of the handcuffs was a tiny sound that felt louder than the explosion. Radcliffe turned, his eyes fixed on Jack with a look of pure, concentrated venom, before he was shoved into the back of the car. Sarah leaned her head against Jack's shoulder, her eyes closed, as the red taillights of the police convoy faded into the distance. Weeks later, Jack and Sarah sat in the center of their empty living room. The house felt vast and hollow without the furniture. Jack's hand hovered over the final page of the foreclosure agreement before he scrawled his name in a jagged script. Sarah didn't say a word as she handed the heavy ring of keys to the court officer. The sound of the keys jingling was the only noise in the room. Jack slung a single canvas bag over his shoulder. It held only a few clothes and a handful of salt-stained photographs. They walked out the front door together, not looking back at the for sale sign or the boarded-up windows of the only home they had ever known. Jack pushed open the door to a cramped, drafty room above a bait shop, where the air smelled of dried kelp and old wood. A single iron bed stood in the corner, and on the windowsill, Sarah set down 2 chipped ceramic mugs. Every morning, Jack climbed down the rickety stairs to the docks to take his place as a deckhand on a stranger's boat. He spent his days hauling crates and mending nets that didn't belong to him, feeling the new calluses thicken on his palms. In the evenings, Sarah met him with a bowl of thin stew, and they ate in silence, watching the tide pull at the pilings. Their world had shrunk to the size of 4 walls, but for the first time in a decade, the air they breathed was clean. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jack and Sarah walked out onto the weathered stone of the breakwater. They stood at the edge of the Atlantic, the wind pulling at their coats. There was no boat, no legacy, and no money. But as they looked out at the vast, darkening water, they stood closer than they ever had when they were rich. The ocean was still there, indifferent and powerful, but the shadows between them had finally burned away.